It's more than fair to expect this Kansas State cornerback room is going to grow and improve drastically this next season.
You are Locked On Kansas State, your daily podcast on the Kansas State Wildcats, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on into Locked On Kansas State, your daily Kansas State Wildcats podcast. I'm your host, Christian Rauh, and thank you so much for making Locked On Kansas State your first listen every single day. Welcome back to my everydayers, and we are diving right in. College football talk. I love it. This is some of my favorite time of the year when we start to get into this hype and speculation, if you will, as spring practice is just getting started. On today's episode, we're going to dive into the press conference from assistant coach Van Malone, cornerback coach. It's going to be more of a secondary talk, but I think it's going to be an exciting one because really, I mean, although with his humor and all the great things that we get to hear from him on the podium, he also makes me want to run through a wall because there's some exciting stuff happening in Manhattan. Before we dive into that, though, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new customers can get $250 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Check that out. Masters weekend, a perfect time to check out FanDuel. We're diving into this presser that happened on Wednesday with assistant head coach and cornerback coach Van Malone. And if you see me just veering off to the side of the screen here, it's because I got it all on paper today. A little bit of a time crunch, couldn't get it on the computer, but I'm going to be looking at my notes, so I apologize ahead of time. But assistant head coach and cornerback coach Van Malone spoke with the media, and first, right off the bat, I mean, just kind of lightened the room, and it was really exciting and really impressive, by the way, too. Had a nice poem for Kansas State writer D. Scott, who is celebrating his 50th birthday, so happy belated birthday, by the way, to D. Scott, one of the greatest writers. I mean, it's such the stuff he puts out on Kansas State's official website is amazing, and all the features are so good. So shout out to him. And if you haven't checked those out, which I'm sure you have, just another nice reminder to go do that. But speaking of just some nice things that we heard from not just, the poems, but heading into the second week of spring practice, Coach Malone discussed how really, I think he emphasized some things about the urgency of moving from this spring window, this workout window into, trying to start learning schemes moving forward. And then in reinstilling the core values of this team and kind of just continuing it on, because there are a few good amount of faces on this team heading into the new year, with 25 new in the freshman class and then a pretty decent sized one out of the transfer portal. And he emphasized, once again, just like Coach Kleiman did last week's presser, that a lot of the leadership, a lot of these older players are stepping up, and that's fantastic because the core values is what they're looking for and all that good stuff. And they want to set that standard early, and having that leadership presence from the football team is absolutely huge. And don't worry, we're going to get into this cornerback talk. We got lots to talk about here on that one. And he brought up a lot of players that, that have been here for quite some time that have stepped up. But one of them that he brought up was not a player that was with Kansas State last year. He brought up a player like Gunnar Maldonado, and a safety that was in the Big 12, played with Arizona last year, is stepping up and showing that he wants to be a voice, a leader on this squad. And that's super exciting, knowing that you're getting it not just from the players that you expect it from, they kind of made their way up the ladder to become that leader, but you're bringing in other voices from other programs, meaning that you're not going to have just stagnant type of expectations, right? You're bringing in different expectations, different ideas from different places. And I think that is probably the most positive thing you can get from the transfer portal, is that right there. Now, of course, performance on the field is one thing, but on an off-field topic, I think what we are hearing from what possibly Gunnar Maldonado is doing, bringing in this leadership and new ideas, is absolutely awesome. I think we saw that at the highest level last year in college football, and we're getting close to the NFL draft. I'm doing a lot of research for the NFL draft. Cam Ward, who is expected to go number 1 overall to the Tennessee Titans. When he went to Miami, we hear a lot of press conference things, a lot of things from his pro days, from other of his teammates, that say he completely changed the culture of this Miami Hurricanes team. And he's been at multiple different programs. He was at Incarnate Ward at an FCS level. He went to Washington State and then finishes his college career at Miami. And having all those different stops, having all that experience that maybe not your average sophomore cornerback this is their second year in college football at the same program is going to have. So bringing all that in is super impressive. And it's really cool that some of these transfers like Gunnar Maldonado is doing that. He's also discussed some of the elephant on the wall topics like roster sizes. I want to get into that in just a few minutes, but we probably should dive into the cornerback talk, because that was obviously the primary focus of this conversation, and for good reason. Assistant head coach and cornerback coach Van Malone taking these questions on Wednesday, and he was extremely proud of. And that was probably the biggest thing I took from this, was how proud he was of the work that the cornerback room did in the offseason workouts. He mentioned how important it is from a player who could show up to spring practice at 185, but instead of showing up at 195, and how that is going to be a big difference, especially in this type of defensive-minded defensive scheme that plays a lot of man coverage with a lot of press. Having that type of strength, and especially if you don't lose your speed, which, as we've seen with this 23-mile-an-hour club, has not happened, is going to be huge. And I think it's going to take a big step forward. I put a poll out on YouTube last week when we were discussing last week's press conference, and I asked, what do you think about these decisions between the 10 practices compared to the 15? There was kind of a contrasting opinion between Kansas State and Iowa State, who, by the way, play week 0 in Dublin to start the college football season. And I let you know that I was leaning more towards the 10, and I am leaning even farther now for the fact of getting that extra strength training, because I do think it's going to pay dividends as we head into the new year. One of the biggest issues, and I don't think I brought this up on last week's conversation when we talked about the press conference, but one of the biggest issues that all college programs face is injuries throughout the year. And you're not going to be able to stop every single one of them. But if you're stronger, if you have more, weight on you, or you're working more in the weight room, and you're having that type of work onto your body being done, you got to think that that's going to help you not get injured as well heading into the new year. So I think it's going to pay dividends, not just on the field performance, but being able to keep those type of players on the field even longer. He mentioned, as I mentioned, how extremely proud he was of the progress of the cornerback room. And that all stems because there's going to be a lot of questions with this cornerback room heading into the new year. And we kind of already had an idea of that. And we got a good taste of what we're going to see in the Rauh Bowl against Rutgers, because we did not see Jacob Parrish, who is going to be, his name is going to be called in just a few weeks. 2 weeks from today, actually, is when the beginning of the NFL draft begins in Green Bay, Wisconsin at Lambeau Field. And I think we are going to hear Jacob Parrish's name on Friday, on day 2. I've seen some things, some mocks that have been popping out, and I have seen Jacob Parrish's name all the way up to pick 62, meaning he's going to be drafted in the second round, if that's the case. And I think that's where we could probably see him anywhere between rounds 2 and 3. And that will just be one more extra win for Kansas State's secondary, for Van Malone, for Coach Kleiman, for the rest of this coaching staff, just to show that they can produce at a really high level. Now, going to what we have now, how do you fill those shoes of Jacob Parrish? And I think Coach Malone is kind of sick of answering this question, because he kind of made a little bit of a joke on the podium where he says, "Oh, Jacob's not coming back." So I think he's heard that maybe a little bit more than he has wanted to in the last probably few weeks since the season has started to ramp up. And I know he wants to dig into these new players, and rightfully so. He should. He mentioned 4 names right off the bat, and I think we have to dive into all of them on this show. He mentioned Justice James, Donovan McIntosh, and Zayshon Rich, the 3 that are returning, and the 3 players that we all expect to have the most snaps, the most meaningful plays in the secondary from returning players. And then he also mentioned a transfer, and it might have not been the transfer that I was expecting for him to hear the name as well. And we're going to talk about that and much more here on Locked On Kansas State. Well, folks, the NBA playoffs are almost here, and FanDuel is giving new customers an incredible way to get in on the action. Right now, when you join FanDuel and place your first $5 bet, you'll get $250 in bonus bets if that bet wins. I love how FanDuel makes betting so easy, whether it's picking my favorite team or diving into player props. And from three-pointers to steals to assists, FanDuel has so many ways to bet on your favorite player props. So don't miss out and head to FanDuel.com. Claim your $250 in bonus bets today. That's FanDuel.com. With the NBA season just coming in here really soon, I have to bring this up. How crazy is it that head coaches are getting fired, just days before the playoffs, and these are like playoff teams, and coaches are getting fired. It's insane. It's insane that we're starting to get that. Makes you wonder how scripted the NBA is, right? Okay, just kidding. Don't go me down that rabbit path. We won't do that today. We're diving into Kansas State's secondary talk. We're talking Kansas State's recent press conference with assistant and cornerback coach Van Malone, and we're diving into that a couple cornerback names that he mentioned, and for good reason. He mentioned Justice James, Donovan McIntosh, and Zayshon Rich, and I think, you look at Justice James, he brings back probably the most meaningful snaps in the secondary for Kansas State. He had over 300 snaps this past season in 2024. Looks like actually 313 to be precise, according to PFF. And if you want to even break them down even more, he had 194 passing snaps and 117 running snaps. So almost 200 snaps where he had to be in coverage. A lot of those happened towards the end of the season as well. From weeks 12, 13, 14, and the bowl game is where he saw his most activity for Kansas State this past season. Now, he got a waiver approved. There was an uncertainty if he was going to be able to return. And that was probably a big deal of why they focused on adding some secondary in the transfer portal. More than just one, I should say, because they had to add some stuff into the secondary. I think that was one of the biggest questions heading into the offseason. I think definitely on the defensive side, it was the biggest priority. I think you could make the argument that wide receiver was the ultimate priority that needed to be done on this program, but cornerback, I think, was a near second or maybe even a 1B in the conversation. But getting his waiver approved obviously is a huge win for Kansas State. And Coach Malone mentioned how he is becoming a leader in this cornerback room. And it could just be from experience, but he mentioned it's more of a quiet leadership role from Justice James. And I expect him to battle for cornerback one, if not be cornerback one, when we get to Dublin at the beginning of the season, just because of how long he's been on this squad, how much, as we mentioned, meaningful snaps that he has taken for this team. So it would not shock me any way, shape, or form if that's how the cards unfold when we get to week 0 in Dublin. Now, for the record, I would love it if we got the depth chart and he was cornerback too. And that's not a knock on Justice James. That just means that somebody else in the cornerback room was good enough to compete for that job and won it. That's only going to make this program better. That's only going to make this team better. So my personal hopes is that he is not our starting cornerback in week 0 for the rest of the season, because that only means that we had a very competitive spring and fall window camps. I think I said that right. And that means that Justice James may not be the starting corner, but we have a very aggressive, very competitive cornerback room this season, which, as I don't think I have to remind you folks, but we play in probably the most craziest conference in college football. There's no more parity than we have in the Big 12, and you never know what can happen. I mean, you can start 7-1, and then you can wind up playing a bowl game against Rutgers, right? I think we've seen that happen once or twice in the past couple of months or so. So absolutely looking forward to seeing what Justice James can do. I think the biggest thing here is just seeing who will compete against him. And obviously we aren't even into the point of fall camp. We still have to wonder what's going to happen with how many players are going to stick around. But when he mentions certain names, I think you have to pay attention to, okay, who are sticking out? If if these coaches who step on this podium, whether it's Coach Kleiman or it's Coach Malone or whoever decides to have the media availability, if they mention a certain player, there's a reason behind that. And I think we have to, we have to grasp anything we can right now and, realize why they're doing that. Justice James obviously is a name that we've all heard, and I think there are some up and downs to his game. And as I mentioned, I would love it to be him to be cornerback 2 heading into the new year, because that means that somebody beat him out, meaning that there is a better expectation heading into the new year. Could it be some of these younger players that we saw step up in the Rauh Bowl, like Donovan McIntosh or Zayshon Rich? I think it could be. I think there's absolutely a chance. There's no doubt about that. I mean, Donovan McIntosh is one of the fastest players on the team, showed off his speed yet again. Coach Malone said that he's not worried about his speed, though. It's something he's always had. He said the thing that he's really focused on and what he's been really excited about and proud of is the growth that he's showing. And he thinks the growth is going to be a big time thing this year for Donovan McIntosh. Great. Awesome. I'd love to see that happen. And if that means that he gets to take another level up in his game, that's only going to benefit this entire program, because what we saw from him in the Rauh Bowl was super impressive. I was very impressed with our young secondary in the Rauh Bowl, almost to a fact and maybe even a fault that I was questioning whether they should have attacked the transfer portal as crazy as they did in that position, because they had 2 young and really good corners coming up in McIntosh and Rich. I'm glad, in hindsight, I'm glad that they attacked and got what they needed, because it's not throwing these guys into the fire, meaning they have to just adapt or die. But I do see that we're going to see a big impact from Donovan McIntosh in this next season. And I think we're going to be talking a lot about him in the coming weeks and months and such, when we start seeing some more film and some more things from practices and camps. And I have a feeling that his name's going to pop up a lot more in these conversations. And same with Zayshon Rich. I think we're going to see more from Zayshon Rich as well. Again, we didn't see a lot of play from him. Mostly all of his snaps came in the bowl game. He had a pretty decent amount of snaps, passing snaps in week 7. But other than that, most of it came in the bowl game overall in his tenure in 2024. I mean, just over 100 snaps played. I think it was 122, if I'm doing math correctly in my head right now, in 2024, with a PFF grade of 62.8. Nothing crazy, nothing spectacular, nothing terrible, though, as well. You can always look at numbers when it comes to PFF and analytics, and you can only take them so far. You have to see it with the eye test as well. And I think we saw it in the Rauh Bowl that there was, dare I say, a star in the making, an opportunity for a guy like Zayshon Rich to take that next step in 2025 and beyond, and maybe find himself to become that next Jacob Parrish in the line of great Kansas State secondary players that can make the step up and ultimately find himself getting his name called in the NFL draft years down the line. I could totally see it. And to be honest with you, I know it's just a small sample size, but what I saw from that Rauh Bowl, we saw him deal with some adversity. He dealt with some issues and then stepped back up and took care of problems. And I think that comes actually with what Coach Malone said during one of his discussions. He brought up how, because of how this team plays man coverage and how this team, utilizes the press and all that good stuff, they have to have what is called short memories. And they instill that. They really focus on that with their mentalities. And he also mentioned, I thought this is a really good point as well, and we probably all could take this and kind of a nice reminder, maybe put it on an index card, put it in our pocket, especially if we're heading to the games. You could win all these men battles, man-on-man battles, these press coverage battles. You could win them 9 times out of 10. But if you miss it one time, he said, this is when the fans in the stands remember just the one time. The media only remembers that one time. I mean, we're talking about what I just talked about, the Rauh Bowl months ago, how Zayshon Rich missed one assignment, but then stepped back up and had a great rest of the game. I mean, if you would have just not worried about that one that we're remembering, we're not remembering his good pass deflections. We're remembering that one bad play he had right before halftime. That's a crazy thing to think about. If you win 9 times out of 10, you should be talking about how good of a corner he is, not, well, he messed up that one time. So something just to keep in mind. But I think Zayshon Rich is going to be a really impressive piece moving forward as well. Before we head to the break, got to talk about this next player as well. And he brought this up, and I was super impressed and actually kind of like threw me back for a little bit of shock. I was expecting some of the other transfer names to be named out, but the one he brought up was surprising, and that was Oklahoma's transfer, Jayden Rowe. 6'5", big type of player, and he made some jokes, lots of jokes on the podium today, which was awesome. It was good to hear. But he brought up some jokes saying that he's going to be a cornerback. He doesn't want him to be moved to any other positions as well. I guess there's a couple talks about him maybe moving because of his size and athleticism, but he was very impressed with what he saw from Jayden Rowe, and that's super impressive. I'm excited to see that because he came in as a possibility of being a linebacker, being a corner, a safety. We didn't really know the position he was going to be when he initially committed to Kansas State. So he's starting to get a solidified role here early. Coach Malone seems to really like what he's got in this portal. And to me, he was the biggest question mark when it came to the corners that were coming in between him and Amarian Fortenberry. And I guess like Marcavius Moss, Gunnar Maldonado, he talked about some of the other safeties, those two. I was really curious to see what Jayden Rowe's role was going to be. And I guess we're starting to get more of a better idea of that heading into these spring practices. Pretty exciting, right? Pretty exciting stuff happening in Manhattan. And again, as I mentioned over and over again, and I think it deserves to be reminded, folks, this momentum is huge. The momentum is exciting, and we need to continue this momentum all the way through spring practice through the spring transfer portal. That's going to be an important thing that we're not paying attention to right now. That's going to come up very quick on us, that spring transfer portal window, which could be the most impactful spring portal window ever. Could be like in the history of spring portal windows. Could be insane because of what's happening on the realm of politics and what's going on with the NCAA with this new possibility now of 105 roster size. We don't know exactly if that's going to happen. We don't know if we're going to get to 105 or if it even has to be. But it seems like regardless of the case, there's going to be some roster cuts. Let's dive into that because Coach Malone talked about that a little bit as we wrap up this episode right here on Locked On Kansas State. And welcome back to Locked On Kansas State, your daily Kansas State Wildcats podcast, bringing you Kansas State Wildcat coverage like no one else every single day. Women's basketball, men's basketball, college football, you name it, we have you covered right here. So be sure to hit subscribe because we are bringing it to you. We're talking college football today. We're talking the recent press conference with assistant head coach Van Malone, also the cornerback coach. That's why we're diving into secondary talk. And we've kind of dug into it. I think we've done a really good job diving into what we've heard from some new players being turning into some leadership roles, hopefully have some bigger pieces. We're going to see if speed becomes a factor. Speaking of speed, we mentioned on last week's talk with the press conference how there's a possibility that maybe VJ Payne could play some cornerback because of how fast he is, fastest player on the team. Another joke came up from Van Malone, said that he tried to offer a trade that involved a Tic Tac and a couple apples. So, obviously the trade wasn't serious, but he didn't rule it out, the fact that he could move to cornerback, right? So something to keep an eye on as well. I think they're going to do anything they possibly can to make sure that secondary is solidified. And I do think this secondary is going to take a huge step forward in 2025. And I know that's some bold words to say after losing players like Marcus Siegel and Jacob Parrish. But look, I think that they added some really good pieces in the transfer portal. I'm not even talking about the freshman pieces that have been added yet. I think we can save that for another episode. But Coach Kleiman said last week that these freshmen are going to have a more impactful role because of this new 105 roster size. And that 105, that number seems to now be a little bit in flux. There, last Monday, this past Monday, if you will, there was supposed to be a final hearing when it came to if they were going to run with these new NCAA regulations, if you will, moving to 105 roster size, all that good stuff by the beginning of play this season. Well, it seems that the judge is not excited with some of the things, and she has pushed the final hearing to the right, gave the NCAA a full week to try and fix some of these issues before they appear to it again. It seems like it's going to happen eventually. And Coach Malone said the word, and I think it's the magic word, and I think it's exactly what's going to happen. It's inevitable that roster cuts are going to happen. But just the question is when and how much. Right now, according to Coach Kleiman last week, and it probably might have moved down a little bit because we have seen a couple players, mainly in the wide receiver room, enter the transfer portal or intend to enter the transfer portal on social media. A couple walk-ons have decided to do that. But as of last week, they were sitting around 125 players, could be at like maybe 123 now. But in the eyes of what is expected to come, that still needs to get down to 105 players. Now, it depends if maybe are any cornerbacks on the list there, anyone in the secondary. I assume at least one player in the secondary is probably on the list of cuts. And then you have to also worry about, you get to 105, sure. But then those players most likely, just dare I say, let's put a number on it, from numbers 100 to 105, those final 5 players probably remain on the bubble during that spring transfer portal window. Because there's going to be other players across the entire country that enter the portal, and Coach Kleiman and his coaching staff and his recruiting staff are going to see those players and say, hey, this player that just left program A can help us and improve drastically at this position and would either be a starter or a key reserve player, but they would be better than player 100 through 105. We need to bring this player in. And that's going to happen with some of these other Kansas State players that leave the portal. They're going to find places elsewhere that are going to take a spot from someone else who was on that bubble, right? It's going to happen. So when we think of 125 players that we're sitting at right now, saying we probably have to make 20 cuts, it's probably more 25 to 30 cuts when it's all said and done, assuming that Kansas State is going to add more in the portal. And the way that this team started off 7-1 last year and have a disappointing finish, although it was a great finish that started all this great momentum with a win against Rutgers, but obviously the result of actually just ending up in the Rape Bowl is a disappointing finish compared to not being in the college football playoffs or the Big 12 championship, which is going to change this next season. Bookmark it. But what I mean by that is the fact that this momentum is continuing to rise, they're not going to let it slow down by holding on to a player when they think somebody else out there in the portal can make them better. It's just not going to happen. There's going to be a lot of tough decisions that we're going to hear over the next couple of weeks. That's what the spring practices are so important, especially how few there are, right? We're already in the single digits after the first practice of how many spring practices are left. We're going to hear a lot of news, and it's going to come very quick. And we might not even get an official announcement of some of these players leaving and entering the portal because it's going to happen so fast, or an official announcement of the roster cuts, if you will. So pay attention. Check out Locked On Kansas State. Make sure that you're up to date with all this stuff because we're going to make sure we keep you covered as good as possible throughout all of it. Everything's being evaluated, said Coach Malone, when it comes to getting down to this roster size. And for the time being, because there is a talk that they could grandfather in this roster. And I still think even if they grandfather it in, I don't think they still keep 125 players just for budget reasons, right? But let's just say they don't, and let's say they stick to this original 105. Let's keep this narrative for at least this next week until we get a more solid, concrete answer. Everything's got to be evaluated. And what does that mean? Well, not only performance, but there's intangibles, there's mentality, there's leadership on outside of the roster. There's potential. Might not have the performance per se right now, but if the coaching staff thinks that you can be a starter next year, but maybe just a special teams or a key reserve player now, you probably have a little bit more weight than the other player who's balancing out to be maybe a key reserve but doesn't see a future with this program. I mean, you got to build the culture, right? And I think that's something that they're going to have to figure out. It's a delicate balance. Luckily, Kansas State's not the only team in the country. Dare I say, every single team in the country has to deal with the exact same struggles. So there's no disadvantage or advantage when going into this 105 thing. It's just an unfortunate scenario that we're going to get these players who have dealt with so many during their collegiate career. They've had to deal with COVID. They've had to deal with extra years of eligibility from players above them, upperclassmen, so that you lose playing time from them, the initiation of the transfer portal. I just saw a tweet, and it was a women's basketball tweet, but 1,300 players on the women's basketball, across the women's basketball in Division I have entered the transfer portal, and only 150 players have committed as of today, as of Thursday. There's going to be plenty of players who enter the portal and never leave the portal. And that obviously happens with every other sport as well. College football is definitely not any different. Probably more than any other sport, college football players who enter the portal stay in the portal. And I'm sure it's only going to get worse, especially this year, more than any other year, when they're moving roster sizes to a cap. So I feel for these players. I really do. So hopefully, I personally want them to have some sort of grandfathered in, or maybe slowly transition it in. Maybe make the roster 120 or 115 this year, and then the next season move it down 5 until you get to your sweet spot of 105 2 or 3 years down the road. Let that be the case. That would be immensely great. But we'll see if that happens. We'll hear more about that in the coming weeks. And of course, we'll have you covered right here on Locked On Kansas State. And I thank you for making Locked On Kansas State your first listen today. For your second listen, check out Locked On NFL Draft. Damian Parson, Keith Sanchez as your favorite collegiate players get ready for that next level. April 24th to 26th in Green Bay, Wisconsin, the frozen tundra, if you will. It's going to be really exciting. So get those latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcast. Thanks again for listening. Please like the video. Please subscribe. And this has been Locked On Kansas State.